The glamour, the charm, the tragedy. That's the John F. Kennedy we all think we know.
The icon, right, Camelot in crisis.
Exactly. But what if the most profound part of his story actually ended right before he took that oath of office?
Interesting.
Let's strip away the myth for a moment and ask, how did this immensely privileged young man develop such a deep and abiding skepticism about the very American power he was destined to wield?
That is the central question.
Today, we're diving into Fredrik Logevall's Pulitzer Prize-winning political biography, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century. And we're trying something new.
A different approach.
Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. This is more than just a summary, which we do include. This feature looks at how the author shapes his argument, how he builds influence and earns, or, well, maybe loses your trust.
It gives you the tools to read with sharper insight.
Should you read this book? This should help. It's also, I think, excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does guide our future content.
And to deliver this analysis, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic look at Logevall's work.
So let's start with the author. What does Logevall bring to the table?
He brings massive credibility. First off, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning diplomatic historian, so he is steeped in the geopolitics of World War II and the Cold War.
Which is the exact context for JFK's youth.
Precisely. And he deliberately uses that historical muscle to frame JFK not as some celebrity, but as a serious student of international affairs, a man shaped by the defining conflicts of his century.
And his authority, his ethos, where does that come from?
It really rests on his meticulous archival work. I mean, we're talking about diving deep into private letters, diaries, unpublished family papers.
Things most people never get to see.
Right, and this allows him to position his work against earlier biographies that maybe overemphasize the scandals or the glossy Kennedy image.
And the timing of this book, 2020, that feels significant.
It's critical. It came out right in the middle of these intense, renewed debates about the role of the U.S. in the world global leadership. Interventionism.
The whole concept of liberal internationalism was being questioned.
Exactly. So Logevall's work addresses the exigence, that historical moment demanding this book. He's trying to bridge that huge gap between the JFK myth and the far less understood and frankly more substantive evolution of his worldview before he even ran for president.
Okay, so he's not just filling in historical gaps.
No, not at all. He's proposing a whole new framework for understanding Kennedy. His core thesis is this. JFK's coming of age, the first 39 years of his life, is completely inseparable from the emergence of what we call the American century.
The two stories run in parallel.
They're one and the same, according to Logevall. Think about it. As the U.S. shifts from a hesitant, inward-looking power to a global superpower after World War II.
JFK is making his own shift.
Right. From a privileged, maybe drifting youth, to a deeply historically conscious political figure. In this reading, JFK's personal development is a microcosm of the entire nation's journey.
So he's not just a product of history, he's reflecting on it.
Actively reflecting on it and often resisting the comfortable certainties of his own elite class.
That's a huge claim. Let's talk about the structure he uses to back that up, because it's incredibly clever.
It is. He uses what you call a braided structure.
One strand is the personal, the family, the chronic health issues, the political ambition.
And the other strand relentlessly tracks the big international events, the Depression, the rise of fascism, the Cold War kicking off.
And that structure isn't just for show. It's a rhetorical move. It's designed to prove that his individual character and the world events around him well, they were mutually defining.
You can't separate them. You can't understand the cautious president without seeing the world and the pain that forged the young man.
And within that braid, what's the strongest thread?
The strongest thread, without a doubt, is JFK's struggle for intellectual independence from his father, Joseph Kennedy.
A very famous and very difficult patriarch.
Profoundly problematic. Logevall provides concrete evidence here, starting with JFK's Harvard thesis, which became the book Why England Slept.
We all know the title, but what was the actual argument?
Well, his father, Joe Sr., was famously an isolationist, often sympathetic to appeasing Hitler.
Right, he didn't think the British had the will to fight.
Exactly, but JFK's thesis, even back in 1940, was a subtle but a powerful rebuke of that. It was all about the necessity of preparation, the moral danger of wishful thinking.
So while his dad was saying stay out, the son was analyzing why democracies were so slow to see the threat.
Precisely. And Logevall uses their letters, the father-son correspondence, to show that JFK was already thinking like an autonomous analyst of power. He was resisting the moral evasions of his own clan.
So that comparison, JFK versus his father, JFK versus the world, that's the logical framework, the logos of the book.
It's deeply comparative, deeply contextual. He's not just making leaps of faith.
For example, he doesn't just say Kennedy was cautious about war.
No. He argues that his wartime experience caused his later nuclear caution. And he backs that up not with one moment, but by showing a documented pattern of behavior, like his habit of questioning generals, that he traces all the way back to his frustrations in World War II.
This is where Logevall really starts to build trust with the reader by tackling what we already think we know.
He does. He uses a counter-myth strategy. He goes right at that callow playboy image.
He doesn't ignore it.
He confronts it. He pairs that familiar trope with surprising evidence. It's a kind of rhetorical balancing.
So for every story of the womanizer, he offers.
What? He offers proof of intense intellectual work, disciplined reading at Harvard, sharp journalistic dispatches from overseas, a real skepticism about the easy answers from the foreign policy establishment. It's a constant, subtle invitation for you, the reader, to revise what you thought you knew.
And the pivot point for that revision is World War II. Everyone knows the PT-109 story, the hero sailor. But Logevall uses it to make a much deeper point.
He does. It's not just about heroism.
He shows that the raw chaos of the Pacific, the institutional failures, the bad intelligence, the sheer randomness of who lived and who died, that was foundational for JFK.
It was a school of disillusionment.
Right. So that cynicism he had about generals and admirals later in the White House.
It grew directly from seeing failure up close. Logevall points out this early habit he formed of asking, from where is this person talking?
Meaning, what's their angle? What's their bias?
That's their self-interest. That instinct, Logevall argues, became a lifelong anti-hubristic realism about the limits of power. It was his inoculation against the arrogance of the American century.
Logevall also builds incredible trust, or pathos, through humanization. To see JFK as a serious thinker, we have to see him as a vulnerable person first.
The pain is central to the story.
He doesn't just list the facts about his illnesses, the debilitating back pain, Addison's disease. He pulls you into those intimate scenes of suffering.
It makes the golden boy image feel much more complicated.
Exactly. You're expected to feel this mix of sympathy and ambivalence. Here's a young man protected by immense wealth, but who is also morally and physically tormented by pain and war.
It's the pain, in Logevall's telling, that forces genuine reflection.
Speaking of genuine reflection, if you enjoy this kind of detailed book breakdown, why not take a mindful moment? Check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought.
So, moving back to Logevall's technique, there's another rhetorical strategy he uses masterfully, what we could call selective zoom.
Selective zoom? What do you mean?
He manages perspective. A chapter might start with this broad, sweeping geopolitical view, say, pre-Pearl Harbor isolationism or the rise of McCarthyism.
The big picture.
The big picture. But then he'll quickly zoom in to JFK's most micro-level choices. A sentence from a private letter, a draft of a speech, a small political decision.
So he moves from the macro to the micro.
Constantly. And that oscillation forces you to see JFK's development as both shaped by massive global forces and as a series of specific moral choices where his own judgment still mattered.
The world set the stage, but he still had to choose his actions.
That's it.
So for you, the critical reader, the book's greatest strength is making the American century feel like, well, not just a triumph, but a real moral hazard for the elites who inherited it.
It encourages systemic thinking.
Right. You're constantly asked to read his choices against his class privilege, his Irish Catholic background in a Protestant world, and the shifting ideology of U.S. foreign policy. It forces a tough question. What does leadership look like when it's born from such immense advantage?
Of course, no biography is perfect. There's always critical feedback.
And what are the main critiques here?
One is that the portrait can feel a little romanticized. Logevall can spend a lot of narrative energy on JFK's charm and charisma.
Which can smooth over some of the rougher edges, maybe?
It can. And there's also what we call the teleological pull.
The pull of destiny.
Exactly. Because we know he becomes president, the story can sometimes read like this steady, predetermined march to the White House.
Which downplays the role of contingency, of mistakes, of just plain luck.
Right. Logevall tends to frame every failure as a learning opportunity on the path to inevitable greatness.
So to wrap up the analysis, what's the essential distinction Logevall wants us to grasp?
It's the difference between information and understanding. The book is packed with factual information. His education, war record, family dynamics.
But that's not the main point.
No, the larger purpose is rhetorical. He uses all that information to get you, the reader, to grapple with the ambiguity of responsible power.
How does that work?
He shows how this strange, contradictory mix of extreme privilege, genuine personal suffering, and huge global change came together to produce a leader who was at once a complete insider.
And a profound skeptic of the very system that made him.
That's the core tension he wants you to walk away with.
And that leaves us with a pretty challenging final thought.
It does. Something for you to consider long after this is over. Logevall's effective use of private letters really establishes Kennedy's personal integrity and skepticism. But how much does that intimate focus on his character implicitly shift the burden of moral analysis onto you, the reader? Does it distract us from a more direct critique of the structural harms of U.S. power during that time, things like colonial entanglements or racial injustice at home?
Something to mull over, for sure. This has been a fascinating journey into the pre-presidency of JFK. If you want even more of the specifics, click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and think rationally.
A lot to think about there.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.